How you doing? Welcome to the 193rd episode of Analyzing Evil, where we're going to talk about a disgraceful Gavone who goes by the name of Ralph Cifaretto, a character who was played to perfection by the legendary Joey Pants. Ralphie is the motherless to end all motherless a cock your own that makes Rodney Dangerfield look like Calvin Coolidge in comparison. But he's not just a big mouth, because what this degenerate deviant with a hairpiece does in this series, oof, Maron. You're gonna have a lot of agita when you get done with this video. But hey, enough of this. Let's get started talking about this chidrul. What are you, Stunad? I said let's go already. Don't make me come over there, you mother... For some of the characters in this story, we're given a lot of insight into their backgrounds that helps us to understand how they got involved in organized crime and how they developed into the people that they are. With Ralph, we find that we aren't given too much about his early life, but we are given enough to clue us in on how he became the miserable that he is. There are two different points where we're given insight into Ralph's childhood and his home life. One is when Ralph comments that his father died when he was 6 and that he had to drop out of school to help raise his brothers and sisters, and the other is when Tony asks Ralph if he ever thinks about his mother and states that he never got along well with her, to which Ralph replies that she had her demanding ways. This really isn't much to go off of, but interestingly enough, these two undetailed facets of Ralph's personal life factor into many of the components that make up Ralph's personality. Ralph Cifaretto is, to put it lightly, an asshole. He's loud, obnoxious, sadistic, and until he experiences the near death of his son, wholly unempathetic and self-centered. And for these reasons, most of the people around him can't stand him for longer than 5 minutes. And just like many people who enter his line of work, like his boss, Ralph undoubtedly suffers from antisocial personality disorder, which only sets the bar for his empathy that much lower and his propensity for violent selfish actions that much higher. Ralph is shown to be overtly malicious with the practical jokes he likes to play as well, as when he suspects that Polly is the one who ratted on him to Johnny Sack about the joke he made, he chooses to retaliate by scaring Polly's mother half to death, which shows you just how kind and respectful he is, and only adds to the despicability of his character. Ralph's mannerisms are often smug and self-satisfying, and even in the most serious of situations, he manages to present himself as an unserious little worm who conveys to us his brutally lax attitude with every move that he makes. It doesn't help that Ralph usually dresses as loud as he acts, and that he has a serious case of face-itis with that hairpiece and shit-eating grin of his.
Pooh, that hairpiece motherfucker.
Despite all the negatives surrounding his character though, Ralph is actually quite the intelligent individual. He's impulsive, and he has a serious drug problem that gets him into a lot of trouble, but he's good with business and numbers to the point that he's the highest earner in the DeMeo family, which aside from his status as a made man, is probably the only reason why he stuck around as long as he did. As much as these components of Ralph are important when trying to understand who Ralph is, as far as his limited background is concerned, it's the specifics of his character that serve as echoes of what Ralph went through as a kid. One of the more defining aspects of Ralph Cifaretto is his overt selfishness. Ralph is almost always looking out for himself and what he can get out of any given person or situation, regardless of how that might make them feel or what it might do to them. One of the more egregious examples of this is when his partner Rosalie is going through a heavy bout of grief after the death of her son. Though Ralph displays some remorse initially as he cries whilst comforting Rosalie, rather than sticking by his woman and helping her through her time of need, Ralph, who is always more concerned with his own feelings and desires, eventually chooses to leave Rosalie for Janice because he can't stand to be around her, as her grief is something that he really doesn't want to have to deal with, not to mention that while she was in the thick of it, he went to stay with his Gumar because he couldn't stand her crying. Now it's true, having to comfort someone through their grief isn't exactly the most pleasant thing in the world. As true as that might be, if you want to have relationships with people, it's something that you're going to have to deal with eventually, as it's a part of life that we all have to go through. And as much as a person crying on your shoulder will rain on your parade, I guarantee you whatever that person is going through is far worse than you having to sit there and comfort them in their time of need, something that the generally unempathetic Ralph only realizes after he's experienced these feelings for himself, after his son is injured, as people with antisocial personality disorder cannot typically connect with such feelings unless they've experienced them themselves. And even then, it's usually quite difficult for them to empathize with others. Why Ralph is so concerned with his own feelings and desires, though, can be traced back to the fact that he spent his entire early life being forced to put others before himself. When a person has to become a parent when they're a child, when they finally mature, it's sometimes the case that they'll veer towards selfishness to compensate for the fact that they spent much of their life up to that point being selfless. So when Ralph becomes an adult, his experiences as a child translated into him caring more so about himself and his own needs rather than those of anyone else, as more often than not, Ralph wasn't exactly thrilled about engaging in the type of behavior that he was forced to display when he was a child. Now, this doesn't happen to everyone who's forced to be a parent when they're a child. But when you factor in the notion that Ralph's mother is implied to have been an abusive woman, you find the avenue that led Ralph towards developing antisocial personality disorder and a lack of empathy for others. Not only is childhood abuse a significant factor that contributes to the development of ASPD, but being forced to assist a parent who is abusing you in raising your siblings has got to give one a warped view of what it means to care for another person. So Ralph's inclination to focus more so on himself rather than anyone else later in life makes a lot of sense when you consider these aspects of his youth. However, his mother's abuse didn't just gift him a disorder and an aversion to empathy, as another defining component of Ralph's character that can be traced back to the abuse he suffered is his need to be liked by those around him. Ralph is ever the clown, the wise guy with the wise cracks, who's always poised to get a laugh out of everyone around him. And while many of his friends make a lot of jokes as well, in nearly every interaction Ralph has with another person, he finds a way to inject a bit of humor into the situation, whether it's appropriate or not. Now, whether his jokes earn him a laugh or a beating doesn't really matter all too much, as regardless of whether or not the interaction is positive or negative, it accomplishes the same thing, putting Ralph in the spotlight. Ralph loves to be the center of attention. He has this inherent need to be the loudest and most colorful person in the room because he spent so much time in his youth being sidelined, and he'll do whatever it takes to ingrain himself in a person's mind, whether that's with a smile or with a snide remark. And I imagine that his antics accomplished much the same thing when he was younger. Gambling with humor with his mother must have netted him either positive or negative attention from her, both of which he welcomed, as I'm sure a kid who was forced to be the caregiver to his siblings, for a mother who was more concerned with lightening her own load than she was with her children, welcomed both smiles and smacks whenever he could get them. Now, as much as Ralph relishes any shred of attention, that doesn't mean he's immune from reacting negatively to people who harm him. We see this many times throughout the series, like with the trouble between Ralph and Tony after he murders Tracy. But what really stands out is his negative treatment of women. While his aforementioned handling of Rosalie's grief, as well as his relationship with Tracy, highlight this aspect of Ralph, it's what he says to Tony in response to his poor treatment of Adriana at her club that explains why he often treats women the way that he does. After Ralph chastises Adriana for forgetting to put extra olives in his drink, Tony asks Ralph why he has to mess with her, to which Ralph replies that she likes the banter. But Tony says in turn that he doesn't think she likes it, or him for that matter, to which Ralph responds by saying that he doesn't give a flying fuck what any woman thinks of him. Now, mafiosos expressing misogynistic attitudes in popular media isn't exactly a new thing, but when you have a man who grew up without a father, who had to contend with abuse from his mother, misogyny takes on a whole new meaning. Ralph doesn't dislike women because he was taught to by men around him who treated them poorly, but because in many ways, he hated his mother, the only woman in his world who instilled the idea within him from an early age that women are a source of pain, cruel creatures that he shouldn't have any regard for whatsoever, as if you give them an inch, they'll take a mile. However, as we've already discussed, Ralph enjoys both positive and negative attention, and because he received both from his mother, there was still a good amount of love for her present within him, alongside his hatred of her, which is exemplified by our first introduction to Ralph. After Olivia Soprano's funeral, we see Ralph offering Tony his teary-eyed condolences and stating that he lost his mother the year before. Now, this could have been an instance of Ralph letting loose some crocodile tears to curry favor with Tony, but I'm more inclined to believe that Ralph actually did love his mother, despite her abuse. And something that echoes this notion is Ralph's sex life. As most of you will know, Ralph's sexuality is defined by masochism and power play, as Ralph cannot maintain an erection unless he's being consensually sodomized or brutalized by his sexual partner while they verbally act as his torturer. While a person's sexuality can develop in this way without having to suffer abuse in their childhood, people who do are more likely to form these inclinations, and that appears to be the case with Ralph, a man who equated his mother's abuse with love when he was younger, and has thus developed a pseudo-Oedipus complex that manifests in his sexual relations with women. Combine all these things with his traditional Italian-American upbringing, which imparts upon people a heavy love and respect for one's mother, and you find yourself with a very confused, repressed, and miserable individual whose experiences in their youth have made them into an unlikable mess of snide jabs, self-centered actions, and spiteful attitudes that repulses people more often than it attracts them. But a person having abnormal sexual proclivities and being rather repugnant and selfish doesn't make them evil, their actions do. But as we'll soon discuss, who a person is heavily influences the actions they take. So what evil actions can we pin on Ralph? Well, he is a gangster, and being a gangster is inherently an evil thing to be, as most, if not all gangsters, are involved in some way or another in the harm of innocence for their own personal gain. We can see that Ralph takes great pleasure in his work, as most men in his field seem to, as he's rather jovial when we do see him ordering or committing crimes, like when he instructs his men to beat up a man named Joe Zachary, when he threatens to go to the EPA regarding their garbage business, or when he takes Jackie Jr. along to see a business associate of his and has a good time beating him up with his stepson. These things are rather par for the course for men in his field though, so as detestable as these actions may be, they're not exactly surprising. As far as the more personally sinister examples of Ralph's villainy and the aspects of his person that make him more detestable than his compatriots go though, there are three things that really sell how horrid of a person Ralph is: his enablement of Jackie Jr.'s criminal ambitions, his murder of Tracy, and his implied arson of the stables that held Pyomai. Like with everyone else Ralph comes in contact with, his relationship with Jackie Jr. is defined by his need for Jackie's approval. And to get that approval, Ralph entices Jackie in the only way he knows how, by playing to his desires. Jackie Jr. was raised knowing that his father was a heavy hitter in the New Jersey organized crime scene, but it wasn't until his father's demise and his Uncle Richie's release from prison that Jackie started to be groomed for a position in the DeMeo family. For that reason, we can blame Richie for involving Jackie in the business, and in all likelihood, Jackie would have continued to involve himself with or without Ralph's influence. But Ralph certainly didn't make it any better. From the time we're introduced to Ralph, nearly every interaction we see him having with Jackie involves his enablement of his criminal activity in some form or another, and he only does so because he wants Jackie to like him. He takes Jackie along with him to intimidate Arouk, as we've already discussed, which is an interesting interaction, as it would appear that Ralph and Arouk had a good relationship prior to this moment, and it says a lot about Ralph's character that he'd be willing to ruin a good business relationship just so he can bolster himself up in his stepson's eyes. Then we next see Ralph providing Jackie with a gun when he asks for one, which doesn't help either, and after a while, we find that Ralph is not only schooling Jackie in the ways of the business and providing him with the tools he'd need to conduct it, but he actively involves himself in his own endeavors by hooking him up with an ex-dealer and taking tribute from Jackie and his small crew. While these are all terrible things to do, as they encourage a man who otherwise might have done a lot of good in the world into unleashing evil instead, it's his retelling of the tale of Jackie Sr.'s and Tony Soprano's stick-up of Feech LaManna's card game that serves as the worst thing Ralph did as far as enabling Jackie goes. After Ralph told him this story, Jackie and his compatriots went on to organize a robbery of a card game in much the same way, only they botched it and ended up killing a well-respected dealer, Sunshine, and injuring Furio, a made man, and in the aftermath, all of those involved, including Jackie, would end up losing their lives. Now Ralph knew full well what he was faced with when he told Jackie and Dino Zarelli this story, two upstart gangsters looking to prove themselves, who were itching for a chance to make their way into the mob's good graces. And so Ralph must have known that telling them this story would lead them to doing something drastic to gain some recognition in the organization. I'll give a small amount of credit to Ralph though, as he couldn't have predicted that they'd do something that would not only endanger their lives, but the lives of others in the DeMeo sphere of influence. But that notion isn't worth much when you consider that Ralph's need to gain Jackie Jr.'s approval led him to an early grave. As heart-wrenching as Jackie's story is, what Ralph did to his girlfriend Tracy is next level. With Jackie, everything Ralph did was intended to be positive. Jackie gets what he wants from Ralph, and Ralph gets what he wants from Jackie in return. But with Tracy, all we get from Ralph is cruelty. Tracy was a stripper in the employ of the Bada Bing Club, and it's clear from her behavior that she's had a rather hard life. Only 20 years old at the time we're introduced to her, Tracy already has a child and is clearly a girl who's crying out for love. She routinely attempts to buddy up to Tony and is as nice as can be when doing so. Unfortunately for Tracy, she's been saddled with Ralph, and not just Ralph, but his unborn child. Ralph treats Tracy as one might expect him to treat a woman he can control. He forces her to engage in relations with himself and his friends. He treats her like a servant when he's at home with her, and he's generally rude and uncouth towards her in public. Ralph even laughs when Tracy is beaten and forced to return to Bada Bing by Silvio as part of her contract, showing us just how little he actually cares for this woman. If you hadn't noticed, the way he treats Tracy can without a doubt be attributed to the faults in his personality that he developed as a result of his mother's abuse, as we've already discussed. And that becomes all the more evident when Ralph and Tracy's relationship finally comes to a head. 3 days after Tracy was taken back to the Bing by Silvio, Ralph sees Tracy at a party at the club. And here, Tracy decides to insult Ralph in front of everyone, and rightfully so. But Ralph, whose psyche has been conditioned to view any opposition from a woman as a grievous insult, is spurred to acting even more horrendously towards Tracy than he already had. First, he seems understanding towards her, empathizing with her hurt feelings, and seemingly feeling sorry for treating her the way he had. But that quickly changes when he goes as far to insult both Tracy and their unborn child, stating that if it's a girl, they'll name it after her, and that maybe she'll grow up to be a, quote, cocksucking slob, just like her mother. This is a heartbreaking moment, as not only is Ralph honeypotting Tracy and then dehumanizing her in the worst way he can think of, but he's doing it to a woman who has only ever wanted his love, a woman who doesn't deserve to be treated this way in the slightest. But for a disgusting man like Ralph Cifaretto, it's just another Monday, and if the interaction had ended here, it might have just been a moment of one abominable man acting in an abominable way towards another human being. Alas, Tracy chose to strike Ralph here, as she should have, but as I've already said, Ralph is a man who can't bear to take any sort of slight from a woman, and this slap from Tracy must have sent him right back to his childhood, unleashing the rage he felt towards his mother and every woman who came after her in that moment, and in a state of fury, Ralph bludgeons this poor girl to death. Ralph does make the excuse later on that he was high at the time, but drugs are no drugs. To do that to another innocent human being who only wanted love is horrifying, and it's one of the more heart-wrenching crimes we're exposed to in this series. Now, aside from showing us just how deplorable of a man Ralph is, this moment also offers us insight into the callous nature of criminals and organized crime, as when several members of the family come outside to see what Ralph has done, and Tony ends up beating up Ralph for killing Tracy, Paulie says that Ralph was way out of line, but when Tony says that this murder is even more tragic because Tracy was only 20, Paulie says that too, implying that Ralph's murder of this girl comes secondary to his challenging of Tony, which is incredibly sad. This notion is expanded upon as this saga progresses, as save for Tony, everyone else involved in handling the tension between Ralph and Tony makes sure to comment that Tracy was a whore, and therefore, she's not important in the grand scheme of things. No matter what a person's faults or profession might cause your views of them to be, a person is still a person, and any untimely loss of life should be seen as the great tragedy that it is, especially when it's someone so young. And the fact that there are groups and the individuals who make them up out there who value human life less than they value a smart mouth from an underling is a testament to just how horrific organized crime is and what it does to the people involved in it. Now, the final bit of evil that Ralph unleashes that we're going to talk about is his implied murder of Pyomai, as well as the 5 others that were stabled with her. In the wake of his son's injury, Ralph had been granted several moments of clarity. He realized that his treatment of Rosalie during her time of need was detestable, and he even seems to have come across a newfound remorse for his involvement in Jackie's death, as he becomes the sponsor of a $20,000 scholarship that's to be given out yearly at Rutgers in Jackie's name. It's even possible that being confronted with the ramifications of being a rather absent father would have spurred Ralph to being a better dad. Regardless, Ralph is still Ralph, and that shows when he has the stable Pyomai is being held at burnt down for the insurance money. In the run-up to this moment, we find that Ralph's behavior towards Pyomai has always been subpar. He hates how much money her frequent illnesses cost him, showing no concern for her health in these moments, and he even tells her handler at one point to inform her jockey not to be shy with the whip when he's racing her. What these things highlight for us is that Ralph doesn't regard animals as living beings, but objects that he uses when he needs to use them. And so 6 creatures suffering a horrific death in a maelstrom of fire means no more to him than swatting a fly does. Now, Ralph does make the excuse that he needs the insurance money at that point in time because of Justin's medical bills. And if it were an ordinary person who couldn't afford their child's care and reluctantly chose to do the same, then perhaps this would be more understandable, if only slightly. But for a man like Ralph, who makes an untold amount of illicit money, there was probably no need for him to do this, as I'm sure he was more than capable of coming up with the money or getting a temporary loan from one of his many business associates. Be that as it may, to Ralph, it was just a horse that was already giving him some headaches, and so without any reluctance, he chose to kill it, to kill 2 birds with 1 stone, never once thinking about how he was ending an innocent life for his own gain, much like he did with Tracy. Well, as many of you know, that would prove to be his undoing. For Tony is a man who, despite his many flaws, cares for the most innocent of lives, and when Ralph murdered an animal he had loved, he also resurfaced Tony's memories of the murder he committed against another innocent that sent him into a similar rage, and Ralph appropriately got his due. And at this end, what is there to say about Ralph Cifaretto? He was a gangster, a rather detestable one, who earned the ire of even his fellow criminals. While Ralph's involvement in the criminal world would be enough to label him an evil man, it's the more personal acts of evil that we discussed that really sell how horrid of a man he was. Despite this, we can say that to be Ralph Cifaretto is to be a man who's experienced hardship and torment from an early age. And for that, like all who suffer an upbringing that warps their characters, we can find sympathy. Not much sympathy, but sympathy nonetheless. It's long been said by many people that out of every character we're exposed to in The Sopranos, that Ralph is perhaps the most sordid of them all. He might not be the most evil, but he is the most disgusting. And outside of that impression coming as a result of his actions and overall person, I think one of the biggest reasons why Ralph is viewed so negatively is because in many ways, he is the worst version of Tony Soprano. Like Ralph, Tony had to contend with an abusive mother, and that severely affected his development. But unlike Ralph, Tony had a few male role models around to teach him the ways of the world. And though we don't know all the facts of Ralph's childhood, it would seem that Tony had a greater support system that allowed him to develop some more positive traits that he might not have otherwise. Though Tony cheats on his wife, he more often than not acts in a respectable way towards women, though he is still quite misogynistic. Tony is definitely a selfish man, but we often find him providing for many of the people around him and catering to their needs rather than just his own. Tony is a crime boss who's committed or ordered many murders, but he values innocent life and strives to protect it whenever he can. Tony makes jokes and gets under people's skin, but he seldom takes it too far, and he manages to remain a well-liked figure amongst those closest to him. As we've discussed throughout this video, Ralph is capable of none of these things, and as Tony Soprano with every positive aspect of his character removed, it's no wonder that Ralph manages to get under so many people's skin. And to really sell this to all of you, I feel the only thing that I need to say further on this matter is that Ralph is Tony if he had been raised solely by Livia Soprano. And that is a terrifying thing to think about. And with that in mind, it makes sense that Ralph, out of all the vile characters in this story, is the person who pops into the heads of many fans of this series when they think of The Sopranos and evil. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Analyzing Evil, and I hope you liked it. What do you think about the disgrazia we call Ralph? Tell me about it down below, and let me know who you want to see featured in a future episode while you're at it. If you liked the video, like it, and if you haven't subscribed already, I suggest you get off your ass and do so before I come over there. Thanks to everyone who already has, my patrons, my members, and anyone who's left me one of them super thanks. And a special thank you to these guys right here. Join my Discord server and my subreddit to speak with me and my community. And make sure you give my socials a follow using the links in the description. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll be seeing you soon.